Right there.
You notice that effortless old world courtesy? Doesn't happen a lot to me. Ladies and gentlemen, we will shortly be seeing a short film of this gentleman's exploits, but let me just do a quick introduction. I think it's true to say that some of us take a very long time to find our niche in life, and some of us never do. But the man sitting beside me today was pretty convinced that his life would involve the high seas when he was just 8 years old, and he wasn't wrong. This year, of course, marks the 50th anniversary of his legendary triumph, being the first person to sail solo around the world non-stop in the Golden Globe race. And doing so in an age when, of course, there was no satellite communications helping to plot the course or tell you about the weather, and doing so when you couldn't just phone back to a team on shore to ask advice or brainstorm solutions. And it gives you an indication of just how extraordinary that feat was when you remember that all the other contenders dropped out. Since then, his other sailing triumphs have been manifold, from winning the second Jules Verne Trophy with Peter Blake to competing in the Whitbread Round the World race, and again sailing solo round the world in 2007, just 2 years short of his 70th birthday. And of course, he established and has been very much involved with the development of the Clipper Round the World yacht races. Compared with all of that, you might think life shoreside would be a mite dull, but it tends not to be if you go climbing with Chris Bonington, or pop over to do some Arctic treks, or go to the Khyber Pass to see what's happening to the internecine warfare in Afghanistan. Frankly, just reading this man's life story running free makes you alternatively quite tired and a bit embarrassed about the amount of time you've been spending on your own sofa. So please welcome one of the UK's great adventurers, Sir Robin Knox-Johnston.
More sofa time.
Now, we're going to watch a short video which gives you an introduction to some of what Robin's been up to these last few years, and then we'll have a quick chat, and then he's all yours. So if we could have the film now, please.
This really must be a tremendous moment for a man who is obviously loving every second of today's sail. Any second now, the black rock beacon stretching out across the water from Tendennis Point will come into view just on the left of your picture. And the cannon is gone. The cannon has gone. The hooters, the horns, the salute. Day 312, about 25 past 3 on April the 22nd. And Robin Knox-Johnston and Sue Haley have sailed non-stop around the world.
So Robin Knox-Johnston is probably the most determined, most stubborn, most interesting person I've ever met in my entire life.
To me, Sir Robin Knox-Johnston is an iconic figure and one of the greatest sailors to have ever set foot in a boat.
The thing that made Robin stand out so much at the time was that he wasn't well known, he wasn't famous, he was an ordinary chap who'd built his own boat and done something that nobody on earth had ever done before through sheer guts and drive and determination.
He created that first non-stop sail around the world that nobody thought was possible, hadn't been done until he completed it. And he's laid that pathway for all of us to follow.
On the 22nd of April 1969, Robin Knox-Johnston, an officer in the British Merchant Navy, completed an incredible feat, becoming the first person in history to sail around the world non-stop and alone. He began his adventure in July 1968, departing from Falmouth in southwest England, returning there after 312 days of solitude. He was a changed man, both physically and mentally, and he had sailed into the history books by completing a feat that, at the time, most people thought was simply impossible. and it not only changed his life completely, but enabled him to go on and create a legacy that has changed the lives of thousands of people around the world. Robin's great venture was underway in June 1968. Making his way south from the UK, he began keeping not only a ship's log, but a diary too, noting that others in the race were about to start their own journey behind him.
19th July 1968, day 35. The alarm woke me at 04:30 from my radio call to Bruce at 0500. Got through without difficulty and had quite a good circuit considering the range is nearly 3,000 miles. Of Ridgeway and Blythe there is no news and keeping a good lookout for them. King and Matessier plan to start in about a fortnight. Those two worry me, as both have larger boats than Suhaili. I will only have 7 weeks start. I can't afford to hang about.
But as he progressed down through the Atlantic, not only was he suffering from a bout of jaundice, but he was facing mounting issues with the stresses of the open ocean on Suhaili.
Well, the first problem was the boat was leaking quite a lot, and so I had to take all the sails down as I got towards the equator and do some repairs in the water. And I tacked a strip of copper along the leaking seam. And it took about 2 days because I could only put one tack in between getting some more air. So I'd get a deep breath of air, dive down, put a tack in, come back up, pick up another tack, take a deep breath down, put another one in, and it was going fine until the shark came along and it wouldn't go away. So that was annoying me because it's distracting. You know, you don't know at what point he might decide he likes my look at my legs. So I climbed out of the water and he wouldn't go. So I threw some lavatory paper in the water. And of course they're scavengers. And as he came to the surface to bite the lavatory paper, I shot him. I watched him sink and waited for about half an hour. And no other sharks turned up, so I was able to go over side and finish the job.
While Robin and the others were battling their way around the world, astronauts were defying gravity and leaving the planet behind. The crew of Apollo 8 carved their names in history when they achieved an orbit of the moon for the first time, followed in 1969 by the moon landings. These were remarkable achievements celebrated worldwide. Only later, when Robin completed his circumnavigation, were these milestones for mankind compared.
1969 was a real golden year for the idea of sort of moving the boundaries, of showing that the kind of things we'd always assumed controlled us and limited us didn't necessarily have to control us or limit us anymore. They were magnificent, those American astronauts, but it was all planned out terribly carefully with their safety very, very much in mind. Robin didn't have that. He was on his own in a boat that he mostly built by himself.
You're looking good here. Okay, we're going to be busy for a minute.
It's easy to put in perspective what Robin did, because at that time they put a man on the moon, and yet they thought it was impossible for someone to sail solo non-stop around the world. So in 68, 69, they equated sailing solo non-stop around the world the same as putting a man on the moon. So that tells you how difficult it was.
And back in 1968, now 4 months into the Golden Globe race, he had encountered more difficulties. As nearing Australia, he'd gone 2 months without any communication after his only radio had become damp and rumours were spreading that disaster had overtaken him.
Once the radio broke down, though, I'd had it. And it was so frustrating because the receiver still worked. And I could hear them calling me, and I couldn't respond to them. And of course, they weren't telling me what was going on. They could have sort of said, by the way, this is happening. So I really knew nothing about what was happening with the others.
After passing New Zealand, he faced the fearsome Pacific Ocean, thousands of miles of solitude.
I ran into a ferocious storm. That's when the waves swamped the boat when I was on deck. And I climbed the mast. I mean, I was getting away to stop being washed off. Not nice. When you see a down big wave coming towards the boat and you're shinning up the mast, hanging onto a wire, you've no idea how high that wave is going to be when it goes over the boat. is it going to wash me off from up here? I just don't know. And then the wave hits, and the whole boat disappears. And you're hanging onto this mast, looking down at water because the boat's not, it's underwater. And eventually, it seems after ages, it pops up, and oh, good. But for a while, there's you and 2 masts and nothing in sight for 1,500 miles in any direction. That is why there's only about 230 people who sail around the world single-handed. 17th of January 1969, day 218. The wind died this afternoon. I've had a lot of sail up at the moment. However, a dark cloud is forming to windward, and I can see rain falling on the land, so I'll probably have to reduce sail shortly. There was a short rain squall, and when it lifted, I could plainly see the 2 tower rocks that make the southwest of the Cape de Hornos. We've passed it!
But there was still almost another 3 months to survive out in the Atlantic Ocean and up through the doldrums for a second time. But he was determined to see it through, focusing on the finish ahead.
Day 312, about 25 past 3 on April the 22nd, and Robin Knox-Johnston and Sue Haley have sailed non-stop around the world.
Eventually they gave me a mooring and took me ashore in a boat. And of course the first thing is I didn't know if I could walk or not. So I sort of stood there, sort of feeling my legs, see if I could stand up all right. Found I could, but I couldn't walk very far. Not more than 200 yards, my ankles wouldn't take it. I mean, dreaming for a long time about what the first thing I'd do when I got ashore, thinking, there's going to be no fuss anyway. So I'll just go to a pub and I'll get myself a pint of beer, a steak, and then I'll have a bath. Because those seem to me to be the priorities. I wasn't aware of the fact there was going to be all this fuss when I got back. So it actually took me a while before I got any of them.
I'm afraid I'm a little bit overwhelmed by the reception. Excuse my hoarse voice. Thank you very much indeed for your reception. That's all I can say.
His sailing knowledge, his impact, ideas and innovation, his ability to inspire, lead and teach others is legendary. And his vision has inspired thousands of people to take up the sport and transform their lives forever.
I think his biggest legacy will probably be Clipper Ventures in the end. I mean, sailing, being the first person to sail non-stop around the world, you'll never take that away from him, but he has introduced so many people into our sport that it'd be very hard to quantify what our landscape would be like.
As a person, he's a guy that stands with you under any circumstances. I can't think of a more man-mountain than Robin.
Robin, by opening up the whole idea of sailing around the world, not keeping it as a little something that only he and a couple of others have done, but to say to a broad audience of people, you can do it, we can help you, but you yourself possess the ability to do this kind of thing, just as I do.
Sir Robin Knox-Johnston is really the complete sailor. Going back to Golden Globe success, Jules Verne, record successes, but biggest thing for me probably, despite all of that, is the fact he's still racing competitively at 80 years old, and that's a massive inspiration. I really hope that I can be sailing like he is at 80 years old.
Sir Robin is a legend. He encompasses everything that has built our sport to what it is today. And I think people probably underestimate or don't even realise just how involved he's been in so many aspects of our sport. His achievement inspired generations to follow in his footsteps.
I think the Clipper race has been one of those things that has brought so much benefit to so many people, changed their lives dramatically. They're proud, they've done something special with their lives. So I think William and I getting Clipper up and going and keeping it running has been perhaps one of the most satisfying things I've done.
Robin is still going strong in business and with his plans for more adventure.
I do want to get back up to the Arctic so we can carry on diving under icebergs and looking at some of the most fantastic scenery there is on this planet. So at some stage I shall wander north again.
Interesting how many of these images had you with a champagne bottle in the other hand.
I know, and I didn't really like it. I mean, I much prefer a pint of beer, but...
And you possibly had one or two of these. Let's just pick up on one or two of the things from, especially from around the world voyage, Robin, because you had jaundice, you had what transpired and subsequently to have been a burst appendix, which, you know, you dealt with all kinds of problems with the boat. The self-steering gear that was supposedly going to allow you to get the odd moment of sleep went. You made all kinds of massive repairs. At no time during all of that were you not scared to death?
I think the person who says they're not scared when you see those 80-foot waves coming towards you is either a bloody liar or inhuman. Of course you're scared. But it's too late. You know, you've seen this wave coming towards you. You can't switch the channel. You say, oh, SH1T, hang on, because this one's going to go over the boat. And if you're on deck, you're going to get washed off, which is why I went up the mast on one occasion. Normally I get down inside the boat. I was safer there. But you know, there are times you look at it, and earlier on, before I really learned how to get that boat comfortable in those big waves, yeah, I was frightened. I mean, I thought at one stage it was going to break up. I was quite convinced of it.
Because she wasn't a huge craft, was she?
She's 32 feet, yeah.
But compared with the kind of monster trimarans that are multi-hulls, that are hulls are going around now, she was a relatively vulnerable craft, wasn't she?
Well, I don't know that she was any more vulnerable than they are in many ways. I mean, she's a tough little thing. Where you saw the pictures of her taken this summer. I mean, I'm still using her. But she's very strong. I mean, she's 1.25 inch teak hull. She's, as someone said when I left Falmouth to go on this voyage, he said, if that boat hits Britain, I'm sorry for Britain.
So it's safe to say both she and the skipper are pretty indomitable?
Well, I don't know about the skipper, but the boat anyway.
When you you said you went up the rigging, and what I thought when I was reading that was it wasn't just that you were up there with these huge waves, but the boat entirely disappeared. I mean, did you have a moment when you thought, dear God, I'm not actually going to have any deck to get back down on?
No, I knew she'd come up, but it seemed ages.
I bet.
It was probably a few seconds, and I'm hanging on there thinking, come on up, girl, come on up. And then
she did.
And then I noticed the hatch was open. So water, about 3 tons of water had got inside, so I had to get a bucket out. The best bailer on a boat is a frightened man in a bucket.
And you were both, yeah.
I was both.
It struck me about you've said quite often, because at the time that you took on this terrific challenge, and obviously it had never been done before, but at that time there had been transatlantic races and so forth, and you seemed to think to yourself, well, this is a bit small beer, I'd rather do something that nobody's done before. Is that a kind of a motivating factor that's been true of pretty well everything you've done?
Well, in that particular case, I never thought of doing the O-Star, as it was called, the transatlantic race. I was always fixed. Ever since I'd watched Chichester go around with one stop, I'd realised there was only one thing left to do. And if we didn't do it first, the French would, and then we'd never hear the last of it. So I thought I'd try, and I wrote to 52 companies, said, look, I've got this great idea, will you sponsor me? And they all wrote back and said no. Well, it's not true. I got a £5 voucher from Cadbury's. And much more usefully, 120 cans of beer from Tennant's. But, you know, I was away at sea. I was first officer on a passenger ship, the Kenya. You can't follow up sponsors when you're away. And so I really didn't stand a chance. And the Sunday Times sent a chap down to interview me, and he said, "You're going to beat Chichester?" I said, "Well, I don't know, I'm going to try." Well, that's an honest answer. That's not what the press want. Press want to say, "Yeah, of course I'm going to beat him, that silly old so-and-so." Well, I'm afraid I'm not like that. And so they turned around and said, "Well, this chap's not determined, he won't make it." Oh well, that was their first mistake.
The interesting thing about, I mean, as you say, it was the Sunday Times, of course, had sponsored the actual race, but the Sunday Mirror had kind of sponsored you. You were their hope in the race. Tell us just a bit about what happened in the end game when all the press were trying to get you.
It was so funny. My receiver was still working, so I could hear all these newspapers coming out to find me. And my boat was like a direction finder. If I swung around, I get the low signal, and that meant they're on that bearing. So I was looking for the Mirror so I could meet them first. In the meantime, the deputy editor was in the hotel, the Green Bank in Falmouth, and the Sunday Times were desperate for a story, and he was refusing to give it to them. And he went in, he organised to be called for a phone message, went into the phone kiosk, which is what you had in those days, spoke for a while on the phone, came out, and as he left, he dropped a little bit of paper. Well, the Sunday Times rushed and grabbed it, and took one look, there's a latitude and longitude, tore off to the airport, where they got a plane on standby, and the pilot said, "Well, where are we going?" He said, "Don't worry, just get in the air, head west." So they get up in the air, and he heads west, and he said, "Well, where are we going?" They hand him this bit of paper. He turned the plane round, and they said, "What are you doing?" He said, "That's Birmingham." And this was the deputy editor of the Sunday Mirror's way of dealing with the Sunday Times. I only found out about it afterwards. I thought it was hilarious. But they used to play tricks, the papers used to play tricks like that on each other in those days. I expect they probably still do.
They certainly, yes, they certainly do. Not that I would have anything to do with anything like that. The other thing, I mean, there's lots of anecdotes about both your going and the return that you've just been talking about. But one of them amused me because at one point it looked as if you might be arriving home sort of early morning on that day in April. Yeah. And then, you know, as it happened, the winds changed and so forth, and you had to beat your way in. But just tell the audience why they were anxious to delay your arrival.
Well, they came out to me about 7 in the morning and said, "What time are you going to cross the finish line in Falmouth?" And I said, 9. They said, "Oh, do you mind staying up?" I said, "Oh, come on, guys. I've been at sea for 312 days. And, I like my pint, my steak, and my bath, you know." And they said, "Robin, be a good chap and slow up." I said, "Why?" And they said, "Well, the mayor and mayoress are going to greet you, and the mayoress has a hair appointment at 9 o'clock. So being a nice, friendly chap, I slowed up. The wind then changed. I had to beat into Falmouth. I didn't get there till 3:20 in the afternoon, by which time the poor dear's hairstyle was ruined anyway. So.
It could have happened to a nicer lady. There's one or two bits in the book that are, now I'm going to have to put this delicately because you're obviously not a man to mess with, but it suggests to me that there's quite a lot of altercations going on, sometimes to do with business deals with the marinas, sometimes to do with boat building or sailing or whatever you're going to do with the rest of your life. And I kind of get the sense that you're not a man who's much given to sharing control of any venture.
Actually, that's not true. William and I have been running Clipper for 23 years. We've never had a row, and we share everything in that. And when we bust the Jules Verne record, Peter Blake and I, and we're the only non-French to have ever done that, we were joint skippers. That was not a problem. I think if you've got someone you respect and you can work with, that isn't an issue. I think it's an issue when you're with people you don't like, or you think, "I don't respect this person," or "they frighten me," on a boat particularly. And if I'm a guest on a boat and I think the skipper's dangerous, get me off.
I think
because otherwise I'll get aggressive.
I think yes, well, there's one or two bits of aggression in there as well, but we'll gloss over that for the moment. The reason I asked that question, there was a particular moment when you were involved with another chap in a marina venture, and you said that you did say you liked him and you respected him, but if he didn't stop interfering with what you wanted to do, you need to get rid of him.
Yeah. Yeah.
You want to elaborate?
Well, not really. I mean, I'm very clear in my own mind what I'm going to do. I've done this before, so I know what I'm doing. And if people start to interfere, you just say, back off. And if you don't, well, this is going to get a bit serious. Now, you can take this what level you like, but back off.
The other people with whom you've come into perfectly understandable conflict are people like the race organisers and what I would have thought of in terms of yacht clubs as the Blazerati, and then here you are turning up in a blazer, which is...
Ruth, I explained to you, it's so simple for a bloke. I have 3 blazers, right? One on, one hanging in the wardrobe, one being cleaned. And I've plenty of these trousers. Now I can wear that more or less anywhere.
And you rotate?
I rotate, yes. So when I get home, these will go to the cleaners and the next lot will come out.
Well, we're very privileged that we've got the one that's just come out the cleaners. There's one other thing that which is a bit personal, but it's something that I was very conscious of when I started reading, especially about the main solo voyage, because I mean, most people thought, probably including you, that you might quite probably have drowned or died en route because it had never been done before, and as I say, because many mishaps befell the other competitors. But at that time, you had a 5-year-old daughter, and you knew your mother was absolutely worried sick, as mothers tend to be in that situation. Did you at any time think to yourself, what is this going to do to the family? Can I cope with what it's going to do to the family?
Well, it sounds rather selfish, but actually, no, I didn't. I'd got so fixed on this as an idea. And I think because so many people told me I couldn't do it. You know, I went over, I was in the Navy, I was a reservist, and I was on a frigate. And I went over to look at my boat at Cowes, and I'm working away on it. It's a weekend, so I'm not on duty. And this chap comes up with his blazer and tie and everything and says, "You're this Johnny who thinks we're going to sail single-handed non-stop around the world." And I said, "Well, I'm going to try and do it." "Well, it can't be done, in case you couldn't do it." And I said, "You never faced me in the boxing ring, pal. You'd never have dared say that." And I thought, you stupid man, what a ridiculous comment. And I said, "You're not a school teacher, are you?" He said, "No, certainly not. Why?" I said, "It'd be bloody depressing for your students." "You can't say that." "I just effing have." You know, I mean, you're dealing with fools like this. These are people who never do anything with their own lives. And they don't want you to do anything because it makes them feel even worse. Well, you just ignore them. They're not worth bothering with. And I suppose with all that going on, I'd focused on this. Now, did I think I was going to drown? No. Otherwise, I wouldn't have gone. I thought this could be possible. I didn't think that I was going to drown. I thought, well, if I can't make it, I'll have to pull in somewhere along the way. But that's as far as my doubts about it went.
That's the gloomiest you ever got about it.
Yeah.
You had, at that point, you had a pause in your marriage. You'd separated from your wife, whom you later remarried, the mother of your daughter, of course. And you say quite honestly in the book that had you still been married at this time, you probably wouldn't have attempted it. So there's obviously some residual balancing of priorities in your life.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Still, I think had I been married, I couldn't have left a wife and child, but I was divorced. So that link has gone. Yes, of course I was concerned about my child, always was, but you know, I'm a seaman. A seaman, one of the things you have to give up is your family life. So you get used to it in a way.
But do they?
Well, they marry a seaman, don't they?
Yes, I doubt many people marry a seaman who's about to pop off around the world.
Well, no, that might be a little extreme. Yeah.
Just a little. There's one thing that I'm going to challenge you with. When one of these idiots was remonstrating with you and was actually casting aspersions on the craft, you said, "Any sailor will understand that you might insult a man's wife and get away with it, but never his boat."
And that shows how serious it is to insult a man's boat. But then, if you think about it, the corollary of it is, don't insult his wife either.
Well, yes, but the corollary somehow got missed from the final edit.
Well, I can't deny the edit, that's accurate. Yeah.
It is a very honest book, though, and we'll move on from that particular voyage because all of the subsequent things you've done, all, as you say, involved huge amounts of seamanship. I think at the end of that rather interesting little trailer we saw, Robin, you said that the thing you were perhaps proudest of was the Clipper ventures. Now, just could you explain to the audience how that came about and what it actually does?
I was in Greenland with Chris Bonington climbing, and
as you do.
This one does. Yeah. Great chap. And he was telling me how much it had cost him to climb Mount Everest. I thought, gosh, a lot of money. What's the sailing equivalent? Circumnavigation. Suppose I provided a boat and a skipper and offered people a place on that boat. How much would I have to charge them to make it work? And I just did some back of envelope stuff, and it came out to about half of the cost of climbing Mount Everest. So I got back and met William, and we discussed it, and we decided, actually, let's try this. So we put an advert in the paper, and we got 8,000 answers.
From potential crew?
Yeah. So we thought, well, we better do this, because having floated the idea, if we don't do it, someone else will. So in 11 months, we went from that advert to ordering and building 8 boats, sorting out the route around the world, training the crews, finding the skippers, and starting the first race. It was a busy year.
Yes.
But, you know, at the end of it, we said, well, what do we do now? We've got these boats. We thought, oh, we better do it again. So we did, 2 years later. Well, 1 year later. And we've been doing it every 2 years ever since. There's about 5,000 people have done it now. Now, what I love about it is how many of them, 40% never been on a boat before. Now, they're the easiest to train because they don't have any bad habits. I can train them my way. But amazing the number of them who take up the sport from then on as their main hobby. And that's what I actually love most about it. And I find them everywhere, you know, from Alex Thompson, one of my skippers. Look what Alex is up to now, possibly win the next Vendée.
I'm absolutely curious, though, about the motivation of somebody who sees an advert who's never been on a boat before. I mean, I can understand the attraction of people who are serious sailors, or even just serious weekend sailors. But for somebody who's never actually sailed at all, to think, I know what, I'll go around the world in one of Robin's boats.
Yeah, and my responsibility is to bring them into it gently. You know, if I've got a skipper and he takes them out in a 4-7 the first time they go out, I'll sack him, because he'll frighten them. And they're right to be frightened. Of course they're frightened. Boat's over on its side, they've never been there before. Take them out, bring them up gently. End of a week, they'll take a 4-7. They've grown in confidence. But you've got to train people gently so they pick it up. Now, as they get better and better, then you can start getting a little bit rougher with them, I mean tougher with them, saying, I expect this, can you do these knots? You know, I expect you to do it, I want a commitment, or you're not going, because you're a danger to yourself and other people. Now, if you set the expectations there, it's fairly easy to push it, to hold it there. If you set it there, it's very hard to push it back up. So you've got to set the standards high and then insist on it. It's for their own safety.
Absolutely. You also make it quite clear in the book, and also in the brief conversation we had before we came in today, that so much of the art of survival and the art of good seamanship is what goes on between the ears as well as your physical capacities.
Yeah, well, you quoted something at me, didn't you, just now? You said, well, what's ocean racing like? I said, look, it's chest with pull-ups. Because you've got to be
chest with press-ups was,
press-up. Well, either will do. But it is, because you've got to be thinking, especially ocean racing, it's very, very tactical. And ocean racing is really all about meteorology. Round the buoys is different, but when you do my sort of sailing, it's the meteorology that matters. So you become a bit of a meteorologist. You have to be. And that's your tactics. But you also want a crew that's fit. Now, the point I was making to you is that actually this is one of the reasons why Britain has more of the top lady single-handed sailors, which we do have, Ellen MacArthur, Dee, and the others, because it's up here. They haven't got the muscle power, but they work out another way of doing it. But because up here they're determined, they'll do it. And that's why we've got the best single-handed lady sailors.
I wonder what you think, finally, I want to bring the audience in, but I wonder what you think of the fact that, not that it's not a huge achievement, circumnavigation, in any way, shape or form, but there is now satellite assistance, there is now a shore-based crew to whom you can communicate and who will, you know, brainstorm with you, all of that. How much easier do you think, that's maybe the wrong word, how much less difficult is it for today's sailors to do what you did?
Well, I think it's different. The pressure on me was just to get round. The fact the radio broke down, okay, it's an inconvenience. And I'll call in, I'll wave to someone off Melbourne and give them some mail and say, report me. Same off New Zealand. And then the 4.5 months when I couldn't tell anyone where I was. But these days, there's different pressure on these sailors because they have to be sponsored. I mean, Alec Thompson's new boat is £5.5 million. I mean, I was chatting to him yesterday, day before yesterday, actually. That's an evil-looking machine. But he's got to justify it to his sponsor. He's got to be on the radio. He's got to have more than one system. You know, part of his job now is to promote his sponsor. I didn't have that pressure. So I think it's changed in a way. Now all they can do is get round faster or beat the other boats. In my case, I just had to prove we could get round.
You could get round?
Yeah.
I guess Ben Ainsley, who we heard from there, has probably got something of the same pressures in trying to put together a team for...
Well, Ben, indeed. I mean, actually, I live about 100 yards from where his base is, and they're getting ready to go out to New Zealand. He's going early because Ben prepares properly, but Ben's probably the best chance we've had almost ever.
Of getting the Americans.
Except Tommy Sopwith, the Ulsterman damn near did it. But in fact, he came even, but the Americans held it, so they kept it. But Ben's probably the best chance we've had for a very long time of winning this America. He is totally focused. He's an excellent, first-rate sailor. I mean, let's face it, 4 golds and a silver medal in 5 Olympics.
Sure.
No one else has ever done that.
Sure.
And so I'm very strongly behind Ben.
There's just one last thing I want you to do for me before we ask the audience to come and join us in questions, and that's just a little anecdote about when they finally know, when word finally gets through, radio contact's restored sufficiently for people to know you're still alive and you're going to make it. And the local padre, I think, in Falmouth was especially pleased.
It was Easter Saturday, and I'd been calling up ships all day. All I had was a signal lamp. And eventually the 18th ship was British. And I realized he was receiving my signal. And I said, you know, MIK, which is please report me to Lloyd's. And he said, ETA. I thought, he's reading me. After 4.5 months, I'll get this message through. And that was 7:20. And at 9:20, my brother answers the phone to be told I was being sighted. The Mirror stopped the presses and changed the front page. I listened in on the receiver the next day on the BBC, nothing on it. So I thought, well, in fact it was, but I didn't know that. So I thought, well, someone else has finished, or he hasn't bothered to report me. In fact, he had reported me. And the Missions to Seaman Padre in Falmouth, a delightful Welshman, was giving a sermon on Easter Sunday. And he was a great enthusiast, David, leapt into the pulpit and said, have you heard the news? Robin's been sighted. Most appropriate on the day of the resurrection.
Could we have the lights up, please? Thank you. Now we've got 2 microphones, I think, so who's going to start us off with questions? The gentleman here, if we can just wait till it comes. Thank you very much. In fact, we've got more than, gosh, we've got 4 microphones.
Hello. Well, thank you, Robin. It's very interesting. I liked your comment, are you a teacher? That must be depressing for your students. Now, when you made your voyage, I'd recently started school, and my teacher, Mrs. Stalker, excellent teacher, every morning she would talk to us about the headlines. The QE2, Concorde, Biafra War, moon landings, and of course yourself. What she said about you, can I bounce it off you and you can tell me if she was right? You mentioned it briefly in the film, that he's been at sea for so long, his sea legs, when he lands, he's going to be very wobbly and it'll take him ages to get back to normal. Now, you said you could walk about 200 yards, but how long did it take you to, quote unquote, get back to normal?
It's a good question. It's my ankles that wouldn't take it. I went, upper body, I put on 2 inches around the chest and around the arm. I was massively strong. But my legs weren't, because you don't use them. I don't remember exactly. First thing I had to do was write the book, and so I focused on that. And I took up long running again, just to build my legs up. And I had to do it slowly. I used to long run at school, and I started building it up very slowly just to build my legs up. So I think within a year I was probably pretty good.
Who's next? Somebody in the front there? Thank you.
How on earth did you survive a burst appendix and jaundice? Did you take antibiotics on the boat with you?
I may have had some. I'm not sure. The jaundice you can deal with. I'd had it before in Africa when I was captain of a ship down there. And it just means you've got to rest and certain things you don't eat. So for the first month of the voyage, I was actually quite slow because I was resting quite a lot. The appendix, I looked it up. I mean, I knew what I got. I got a hell of a pain in my stomach. And I thought I'd poisoned myself with my cooking, to be honest, and got appalling indigestion, not for the first time, only this was worse. And I got out the ship's captain's medical guide, and I read up the symptoms. And I was either pregnant or I got appendicitis. So I thought, oh, that's not very good. So I went on a slops diet. I was actually doubled up for 3 days. I couldn't move. It was just moving enough to get some oatmeal and condensed milk. It was about all I was eating. And then after a while, the pain eased and everything's fine. I forgot about it. About a year after I got back, I was driving down to Exeter and suddenly felt pains in my stomach. And I pulled into the police station at Bridport and says, there's a doctor here because I'm hurting. And the doctor poked around. He said, straight back to Southampton. And I'm going to call the hospital. They're going to pick you up. I said, what's the problem? He said, what do you think it is? I said, it's my appendix. He said, yeah. And they operated on me that night, and the surgeon came round the next day, and he said, you had pains before? I said, no. Well, you forget about it, don't you? And then I said, well, yeah, I did actually. Yeah, I did. He said, yeah. He said, there's a lesion on your appendix. It had burst and patched us up. Now, I saw him again about 10 years ago. He gave a talk for a church fundraising thing. And I said, can you confirm that? He said, oh, yeah, no question about it. You're very lucky to be alive. Your appendix had burst and patched itself up. So I thought, every day's a bonus.
I'm glad you asked that because I wondered about that as well. One there and then one on the aisle.
Good afternoon, Robin. I'm curious to what extent or how much contact you had either prior to the race or during the race with Donald Crowhurst, and what, in your opinion, you think possessed him to do what he did in the Atlantic?
I think you better explain the background to that.
Donald Crowhurst was one of the 9 of us who set out, and he never left the Atlantic, but he sent false messages, giving the impression he was sailing around the world. I'd never met him. I didn't even know of him when I sailed. He came along later. I found out about him in New Zealand when I was aground, waiting to float off. What possessed him? I think his business wasn't doing very well. Any of you seen that film, The Mercy? Well, I think they handled it rather well, actually. His business wasn't doing well. He thought this was a way to get his business boosted. Was he suitable? No. He had the wrong character completely for it. He wouldn't be able to do it these days because these days you have to qualify. And he'd never have got ready in time anyway. But he went ashore in Argentina, so he disqualified himself there. He then came back up the Atlantic, still giving false messages. And Tetley, who very nearly made it, his boat broke up 1,000 miles from the finish. He's the real tragedy of the whole thing. He thought, well, Tetley will be second, and they won't bother examining my logbook, and I'll be okay. And then, of course, Tetley's boat broke up, and he suddenly realized when he gets back, he's going to be examined. Chichester was onto him. Chichester was very suspicious of him. And I think it just grew on to the point where he said, I can't face this. And, well, we'll never know fully, will we? We think he just jumped overside. But he should never have gone.
It might be useful to know that after the race, the prize that cash prize that Robin won was given by Robin to Crowhurst family.
Well, we're going to lose the house, you know, you can't have that.
More questions? There was somebody on the aisle, yes, thank you.
Robin, thank you for sharing your adventures and your stories of life. It's a great accomplishment. Really proud to just listen to you. I'd like to ask a question. Whether you're teaching a novice, someone who's never sailed before, or someone who's sailed their whole life, what is the message that you really instill in them to make them something that they aren't?
I don't, just correct you on one thing, I don't think it's something they aren't, it's in them. You've got to find it and develop it. I think it's instilling in people, A, safety. I'm going to make you do this. You can't tie a bowline, right? Well, you're going to tie 10. And if you make a mistake on number 9, we start at 1. And I've done that a number of times, and people see me walking around with 2 bits of rope and they scatter now. They know what's coming. It's making people realize the sea doesn't take prisoners. It can be extremely dangerous. And therefore, unless you take it seriously and take your training seriously and learn and learn and learn, you are a danger to yourself and to the other people you're sailing with. If you tie a bad knot and someone's life's on the other end of that bit of rope, you've more or less murdered them. Well, I won't have it. You're not going if you can't do these knots. I'm quite ruthless about it because it's the safety of everyone. So I think it's a question of getting hold of people and saying, now look, you're going out into an alien environment. It can be very dangerous. We know how to deal with it, but we can only deal with it if you settle down and learn. And I'm going to teach you. I'll be incredibly patient, but you're going to learn. And we're going to go on and on and on until you have learned, and I consider you safe to go. So, and quite often, I mean, I'm sailing next Monday round to London. I've got people on board who've never sailed before, but then I've got 4 of us I sail with regularly, good people. Otherwise, they wouldn't be with me. And that one person will be watching them, helping them, teaching them, encouraging them to take up our sport, but making them safe. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. I appreciate the step-by-step approach that we all need to take, so thank you.
How big a factor is temperament?
Someone once asked me what you look for in the crew. Sense of humor. Absolutely vital. When things go wrong, if you sit there saying, oh, we're doomed, you are. If someone cracks a joke, immediately everyone's now positive and you're dealing with the problem. So you want a sense of humor. You've got to have enthusiasm, because without that, why are you there? Mm. And the final thing is, I like people who don't wait to be asked to do. They can see what needs doing, go and do it.
And get on with it.
And those are the people I tend to keep as my regular crew. I don't have to push them, they push themselves. For me, those 3 things in a person make for me the perfect crew.
Good. Now there's a gentleman with a hand up here, and then there's another one there. We've only had one female question so far.
There's one there.
And I'm very keen on gender balance. Hello. So after you've had it right there, and then we'll pass it along to the lady here. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Robin. How did you cope with the solitude?
Do you know, a journalist said to me, how are you going to cope with the solitude? He said, have you been alone before? I said, been on the bridge of a ship for 4 hours with a couple of Secunnies, but otherwise, no, I haven't. He said, well, how are you going to cope? I said, don't know. He said, well, you're going to cope. I said, look, if I'm back in 2 weeks, I haven't. So, do you know, but when you've got this idea and you're fixed on it, and I'm going, actually, if this had been easy, someone else would have done it, wouldn't they? So this is all part of the price you pay to do it. And part of that price is, okay, I'm going to be on my own. But actually, you're busy. Bear in mind, no satellites. I'm spending 2 hours a day with a sextant and calculating a position without calculators in those days. So that's 2 hours of my day. I've got to cook, I've got to repair the boat, I've got to sail it. You are busy. And that passes the time really quite nicely.
Is the mic along here now? And then there's somebody behind, I think.
It's a very personal, I mean, it's a very feminine question I'm going to ask you. How did your daughter survive your absence, and has she become a good sailor?
Well, the latter, yes, she's a very good sailor, actually. Like an awful lot of women, she's very good at light weather sailing. We're in focus, whereas men will start talking about the latest football match. Women will focus. We found this in the Navy. You put a woman on a screen, she'll focus. The blokes start arguing about Manchester United. And you say, hey, there might be a missile coming in, lad. Focus on that screen. I don't think, she hadn't seen much of me. I've been away at sea. As she said, this big man used to come along with very hard hands and take me out. And so I think it was, oh, well, Daddy's gone sailing again. And so, I mean, she was 5. I don't think she's never said it had any particular effect on her when I asked her the question. And her only reaction when I got back was, oh, Daddy's hit the headlines. Yeah. Don't think she knew what that meant, but it didn't matter.
She heard it somewhere.
Yeah.
Now, I'm conscious of the fact that I'm taking people at the front. So somebody there, but then there's a gentleman in the middle immediately afterwards. Thank you.
Hello. I completely agree with you about women sailing in light winds. I always get given the kite to try and get something out of it when there's not much breeze. I'm interested in your view on technology and people sailing in safety, because people are coming into the sport of sailing and diving actually only using dive watches and using GPS, and not actually able to use the analog charts and compasses and other tools that we use, sextants, and know how to look at tide tables and things. They rely too much on technology, which can often go wrong. Do you have a view on that, about how we keep people rooted to the fact that when it comes down to it, it's just you and your basic tools, and digital's not everything?
Well, I probably find myself agreeing with really what you're saying. I mean, the great advantage of GPS, it has made it possible for people who wouldn't have had the confidence to go and make voyages to actually go and do them. But then you say to them, yeah, but what happens if it breaks down? What's your backup? Can you navigate along the coast? I mean, how many boats carry charts now? An awful lot of boats have plotters. And you say, well, yeah, but have you got any charts as well in case the plotter breaks down? Now, I've got a plotter on both my boats, but I've got the charts as well. The sextant's there, the tables are there. If GPS goes down, I will get my sextant out. But I suspect a lot of people would say, what do I do? Have they kept their log properly? When was the last time they noted their position? Because you have to work out how to get to a destination from where? From the last position you noted. So on my boat, I want a log position every 2 hours and the logbook. And I expect my crew, whoever's on watch, to do it. And then if everything turns to custard, I say, well, I know where I was 2 hours ago. What speed was I doing? What direction? Okay, I'm probably here. Okay, I'll work it out from here. But I'm not sure, unless people start doing the RYA courses, which I encourage everyone to do, I'm not sure enough people do take it that seriously, and they ought to.
I'm very conscious that gentleman's waited for a while in there. You keep your hand up and the mic will come. If you could make it a brief question, sir, because we're really out of time, but thank you.
Thank you. Notwithstanding the huge success of the Clipper races and other sort of big yachting events, the Olympics and such like, do you think there's a problem in people, just ordinary sailors? Dinghy clubs are not doing so well. There are not that many people coming into cruising 28-foot, 30-foot boats in their 20s and 30s. It's too expensive. So that for ordinary sailing, things don't seem to be quite as good as they were 20 or 30 years ago.
I'm not sure about these figures. I mean, I've heard what you've heard, but I'm not certain. I talked to Sarah Trester of the RYA about it. I'm not sure there's a huge difference. You see, I think the media have got a lot to answer for, because they always give the impression that boats are terribly expensive. My daughter bought a boat 3 months ago, 27-foot, lovely little cruiser, £4,000. That is not expensive. You might buy a second-hand car for that. The average price of a boat in this country is less than the average price of a caravan. But you talk to the BBC and they say, well, it's elitist, isn't it? I had this when I was doing the Today programme. This young researcher said, yeah, but it's elitist, isn't it? I said, what, like driving? She said, well, no, why? I said, people out there with Rolls Royces. That's pretty elite. I said, have you ever been to a sailing club? No, what's that? Buy a boat for 800 quid. Oh, can you? Yeah, you see, they've got it fixed in their minds. Every yacht club's got Royal in front of it. And it's all very wealthy people. They haven't been to a sailing club where the strength of our sailing actually lies, which is made up of ordinary people who haven't got pocketfuls of money, but they've got enthusiasm. My local club, Portsmouth Sailing Club, don't think we've got a millionaire in it. And yet, enthusiasm's tremendous. And that's where the strength of sailing really lies, in the sailing clubs. So I think if we can encourage them and stop the media constantly referring to it as an expensive sport, because media are only interested in the top end. When I was in the Admiral's Cup team, yeah, the owner was a millionaire, the rest of us weren't. I was doing 4-deck with a bricklayer's apprentice. They weren't interested. They wanted the millionaire. I said, but there's the interesting story. Why have you got a bricklayer's apprentice on this racing yacht? Yeah, but it's not interesting. I said, it is. Isn't he out of space as far as you're concerned? The reason he's there is he's damn good, and we want to win races.
I'm going to stop you there, Robin, before you malign the media anymore. But also because we are out of time, but happily for us, ladies and gentlemen, Sir Robin's going to be in the main signing tent where you could have another blether with him, as we say in these parts, and buy a copy of this book, because it's, as you might imagine, a cracking read. So if you'd let us get off the stage first, that would be grand. But in the meantime, please join me in thanking Robin Knox-Johnston.